initial remarks to kind of contextualize her visit. I'm Arlene Torres. I'm an associate professor here in Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino studies, and I also direct the Latino Faculty Initiative for the CUNY system. And for me, it is a real pleasure and an honor to be engaged in this conversation this afternoon. The title of this presentation is Dr. Elena Padilla, a Pioneer at the Crossroads. And what we're going to do today is have a conversation between Puerto Rican women scholars who I argue are building bridges and challenging the boundaries in the field of Puerto Rican and broader Latino studies. And as I said, I'm honored that I'm going to have the opportunity to introduce you to two distinguished speakers and to serve as a moderator in this collective conversation about Elena Padilla, a pioneer, her legacy, anthropology, American studies, Puerto Rican studies, and scholarship and the commitments of generations of Puerto Rican scholars. The event today is being co-sponsored with Centro and the Arts and Sciences 2012-2013 Research Writing Seminar entitled Race and Ethnic Inequality in Post-Racial America. I want to give a special thanks to Ms. Evelyn Collazo, who helps to facilitate always the evening programs, and to Mr. Jose de Jesus, who is always ready to assist me with the logistics to allow for co-sponsored events. And finally, to my colleagues here at Centro and in the Research Writing Seminar, whose shared vision allows for these events to come to fruition. Before I get started with additional comments about today's presentation, I want to alert you to the calendar of events. It's on the back table if you haven't received one already, and to an upcoming presentation that's going to occur on Thursday, April 11th, which is a research seminar, Jobs and Education of Puerto Ricans in the United States, and researchers Ramon Borges Mendez, Edwin Melendez, Luis Reyes, and Ann Weiser will be presenting. And I want to encourage you to attend that event again next Thursday from 6 to 8 p.m. Additional events, again, can be found on the flyer that's located at the table. The edited volume, and this is the edited volume that we're going to be focusing on today, Latino Urban Ethnography and the Work of Elena Padilla, focuses on the 1947 master's thesis, Puerto Rican Immigrants in New York and Chicago, a study in comparative assimilation, and its implications for contemporary research in the social sciences. It speaks to the intellectual legacy of Dr. Padilla, who served as a scholar in residence at St. Barnabas Hospital in the Bronx and is Professor Emerita of New York University. Dr. Padilla served as a research assistant for the noted sociology C. Wright Mills and helped to produce the seminal text, The Puerto Rican Journey, published in 1957. She also conducted her own groundbreaking study, Up from Puerto Rico, published in 1958, of which we have a copy here. Her work established a foundation that would challenge the emergent culture of poverty thesis and related public policy. Prior to this, she also served as a senior researcher for the Stewart edited volume, The People of Puerto Rico, published in 1956. Dr. Merida, to my left, is interim chair and associate professor of American Studies and Latino Studies at Williams College. She conducts historical and ethnographic research in Chicago, and in addition to the edited volume, she recently published Grounded Identidad, Making New Lives in Chicago's Puerto Rican Neighborhood. This is the new publication. Professor of American Studies Thomas Guglielmo's notes, and I quote, "Part history, part ethnography, part memoir, and part methodological rumination, A Grounded Identidad is a marvelous achievement, drawing on the voice of ordinary people at every turn." Mérida offers a beautifully written, deeply researched, and moving account of the making and remaking of Puerto Rican Chicago, end quote. And needless to say, and I will have to say I'm quite biased, she learned well and built upon the foundation of the person I call her intellectual grandmother, Dr. Elena Padilla. For the purposes of this evening discussion, what I want to do is to propose some topics for discussion related to Dr. Rua and Dr. Padilla's work. And by way of introduction to this conversation, what I'd like to do is to begin with Dr. Rua. At one point in her scholarly career, Merida came into my office. I think she might have been 19 or 20 years old at the time. And she asked me about Elena Padilla. Smiling, I remarked that there is much to be understood and yet to be written about one of the leading figures in the anthropology of Puerto Rico, of Puerto Ricans, and of the diaspora. So I'm going to leave you with Merida so that she can introduce you a bit to what led her to Dr. Elena Padilla.
Thank you. I did want to acknowledge one person who's also part of the edited volume, so Ana Yolanda Ramos Saez, so I just wanted to say hello, and you can also direct questions to her at some point if you wanted to. I actually went to undergrad at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and poor Arlene was just a graduate student mentoring an undergraduate student at the time. And I had been thinking about a paper, and I wanted to do a comparison of Puerto Ricans in Chicago and in New York, and I thought, oh, I have this groundbreaking idea, it's going to be amazing. And then I find this thesis that was written in the 1940s on Puerto Ricans in Chicago and in New York. And at first I just kept thinking, who's this woman who stole my project, you know? But being an undergrad, I was more upset at the fact that somebody wrote about it, so I never looked it up. So I just saw it when I did the kind of library search. That at the time I think it was the cards. It wasn't even the computer. And when I went back to Urbana to pursue a master's degree, I thought, okay, I think instead what I want to do is I want to do a study of Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in Chicago and thinking about the construction of a Latino identity. So again, I start to do the research, and lo and behold, the master's thesis emerges again. She not only did a comparative study of Puerto Ricans in Chicago and New York, but then also thought about what does it mean for Puerto Ricans to be in Chicago when there's an established Mexican community there? And she compared that to Puerto Ricans in New York and the established Italian community in New York. So then I thought, oh my God, here again, she stole my idea. And so what do I do with it? But this time I actually decided to go and look at the project itself. And I was just fascinated by it, the fact that she actually documented the early migration of Puerto Ricans as laborers to the city of Chicago. But then the other piece of it was that she focused on women, and I had never really heard of the migration story of women. It's usually this idea, and C. Wright Mills does this in his book, where women are followers, right? And that the men are the ones that are kind of leading and working and things like that. And so the fact that she did that fascinated me. And then just other little things started kind of emerging, or my mind started just kind of moving in all these different directions, looking at her footnotes and realizing that, oh, wait a minute, this person, she keeps citing this woman, Muna Muñoz Lee. I wonder if she's related to Luis Muñoz Marin, and it's his daughter who winds up at the University of Chicago with her. And then she's also talking about Jesús Colon. And so I started to think about, okay, she's making these connections, not just to, comparative work, but to understand what's going on in Chicago, you also always have to put it in relationship to what's happening in Puerto Rico, the people in Puerto Rico, but then also connecting it to New York. And so I think for me, it became a model of, the kind of work that we need to be doing in Puerto Rican studies, where we don't study Puerto Ricans in isolation, right, to learn something about them. And for some reason, I think that particular model, people stopped doing that. And so, here when we think about today, everyone's into kind of comparative race and ethnicity and how cool this is. Here was a woman that was already doing it in the 40s.
Okay, so to follow up on that, I guess this question, you've already started to answer it. Why did you decide to re-examine the master's thesis via the scholarly interrogations and reflections of a new generation of scholars concerned with Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans, and the broader Latino diaspora in the U.S.? Let me just say that within the book, the original 1947 master's thesis is published, but then a host of scholars, contemporary scholars of Merida's generation, Ana Yolanda included in the between and between generation, I'm included there as well. We made comments on the 1947 master thesis in relation to our own scholarship. So if you could talk a little bit about what your thinking was there.
I think some of this, I owe a huge debt to Ana Yolanda and her work, National Performances. And the work that she did in terms of Puerto Rican, studying nationalism in the diaspora, right, and then focusing on Chicago. She was one of the few people that, was also really thinking about Elena Padilla's work. I think most people, when they think about studies of Puerto Ricans in Chicago and Padilla, they think of Felix Padilla's work, Puerto Rican Chicago, or the title of Latino Ethnic Consciousness, which is where he actually does the kind of thinking through the creation of a Latino identity, and he calls it Latinismo. And so here's somebody who winds up doing very similar work to Elena Padilla, but yet he's the person that most gets cited. His work comes out in the 80s, I believe, right? And so she was one of the only other people I knew outside of Arlene that was actually talking about Elena Padilla's work and how good it was, and yet how overlooked it had been. And so, Ana Yolanda started to do this work, and then there's Gina Perez's work on the Near Northwest Side Story, where she's also returning to Elena Padilla's work. So there was a group of women scholars, mainly anthropologists. I mean, I come out of an American Studies program, so my training is much more interdisciplinary. But we were beginning to have these conversations, and then the Puerto Rican Studies Association was going to be hosted in Chicago, I believe in 2000 or 2001, and we decided why not kind of honor the work of Elena Padilla there, and that we wanted to do a panel where people revisited the thesis, and the other thing that we decided to do was to invite other scholars who might not have been working with Elena Padilla's thesis, but that were doing either interesting work on Chicago or interesting work on the island or New York. And so this is where we invite Nicholas de Geneva, who was doing work on Mexican Chicago, and Saida Dincy, who was doing work on the built environment in Puerto Rico, but then she connects it to New York and to Chicago. So that, basically people that we were in conversation with that we thought could use or draw from Padilla's work, we thought it would be great to do a panel to kind of show the significance of this work beyond just Puerto Rican studies, but yet where Puerto Rican studies is so central.
Okay, so let me talk a little bit about another influential work, one that I showed here, which is Up from Puerto Rico. And that particular book I think is in some ways very dear to my heart and dear to Merida. I was not really familiar with the 1947 master's thesis until I ended up working very closely with Merida to look at the thesis itself. I was much more familiar with Up from Puerto Rico and the kind of ethnographic community study, if you will, that she was engaged in, focusing on the experience of Puerto Ricans in New York. And I consider this to be a really, really special book, one that people didn't have access to. The book Up from Puerto Rico now is currently in a special collection at the University of Illinois Library, where I was a faculty member. Upon receipt of tenure, faculty are asked to provide the name of an influential work, and we can pick any book. And I selected Up from Puerto Rico. The book was retrieved from the stacks, restored because it was in very, very poor condition, and a nameplate honoring me as a faculty member and the day that I received tenure tenure was inserted in the book. The book is now part of University of Illinois' special collection, as I said earlier. And of all the books I've had access to in my career, I wanted this one to be highlighted, so that Puerto Rican and other Latino students I encountered there would have access to great books. And that we as a community of scholars, as authors, would be read. Because Elena Padilla, as a young girl, was sent to Illinois, was sent to the University of Chicago to study great books. And among those great books, Puerto Rican authors were not to be found. And so for me, it was a political statement, part of an intellectual legacy about the importance of Up from Puerto Rico as an anthropological study that dealt specifically with the New York experience. Merida read it from a different vantage point, but I think in some ways building on our shared love for Elena's scholarship and commitments. And so I guess my question to you is, how did this book influence you?
Well, for me, it was learning that it was the first book in terms of a major study about Puerto Ricans in the diaspora that was actually undertaken by a Puerto Rican. And not many people know that. I think the other piece was then understanding her trajectory. I found it fascinating that here's somebody whose career starts off in the diaspora, studying Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, but it's the diaspora that goes to Chicago first. And so then from Chicago, she winds up going to Puerto Rico to do the people of Puerto Rico, and then she does New York. So she does it in a very reverse fashion from what I think other people would assume how it is that you wind up studying the Puerto Rican diaspora. So I was always just fascinated by that. And I think, she'll probably tell you it's always been by accident, it's never been by design. But yet I feel that these are the ways in which she just made these important contributions over and over again to get us to think about the relationship between, migration and labor and issues of health. I mean, she starts that off thinking it through in the master's thesis. She starts to think about some of these things and her contribution to the people of Puerto Rico. And then it's really laid out in Up from Puerto Rico itself.
And then I think one of the other major contributions of Up from Puerto Rico is its style. She was writing at a period of time where she was expected to have a real kind of omniscient and objectivist point of view. And as you read through the pages, what you see is that she works very hard to elicit the voices of the Puerto Rican community in New York, and of individuals themselves and of their voices and of their perspectives. And she inserts that in here to really give you a sense of the cultural milieu. And so what she's also doing in that particular context is she is providing a very, very critical review of the work of Oscar Lewis and the theory of the culture of poverty. So in a sense, Up from Puerto Rico, so to speak, and very candidly, slaps in the face the disciplines of anthropology and of sociology and of those scholars who worked within that culture of poverty paradigm. And she was proposing that that scholars needed to look much more critically at what was happening to the Puerto Rican community in New York and elsewhere. And in doing so, what she did was she painted a portrait that was much more complex. And unfortunately, what we did see all over the place were the Oscar Lewis publications instead of this great book. Why don't we take a little bit kind of a breather, because I have lots and lots of questions that I've written, and to see if anyone has any comments that they want to make so far. Or questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
In terms of the comparison of women, my understanding of Puerto Rican women in New York was the garment industry. Was that the same thing in Chicago, or was it a whole different?
No, they were actually recruited to do domestic work. And so they were coming in to be maids. And it was interesting how it was also divided. Even though the ad, and I talk about this a little bit, I think in both books it's actually mentioned. So the ad that comes out, the recruitment office that was bringing Puerto Ricans, when they put the ad in the newspaper, they said like white Puerto Ricans to be hired as maids. But what happened was when the Puerto Ricans got there, no one thought that they were white. And so then, and even the shade, so you started to see how the city itself was divided racially. That was also how you started to see the maids where they were being sent. So if they were darker complected, they were being sent sometimes to the south side or sometimes, depending on where these things were happening. But what was interesting as well is that communities didn't get formed then because they didn't have a place to live because they were living, wherever they were being employed in terms of the women. And so the YWCA of Puerto Rico contacts the YWCA in Chicago to see if they could kind of bring the women together for tea time, and it was also a way of kind of assimilating them to what was going on. And this is where the women actually come together and start to form a community, and they talk about what's going on in terms of their employment, how they're feeling that they're not being fairly treated. And this is when they also start to organize. And so the students from the University of Chicago wind up connecting with them and actually helping them in those ways.
And Elena Padilla's origins, how did her family wind up in Chicago?
So she was a student. So she was part of Jaime Benitez, who was the chancellor. I don't think he was the president at the time. He was the chancellor at the time, and he went at the University of Puerto Rico. He went to Chicago for, I believe, undergrad or maybe even his master's. I don't remember. But what he would do is he liked to send graduates from the University of Puerto Rico.
So she came from Puerto Rico.
Yeah, she came directly from Puerto Rico. So there was a cohort. He always sent cohorts. So that he either sent them, the ones that went to Chicago were to be the future faculty of the University of Puerto Rico. He sent a group to Harvard to be the lawyers. And then, what was it, Michigan? Michigan were the doctors,
school.
yes. Mm-hmm.
What was the reactions or the reception in Chicago of bilingual, bicultural education? For example, in New York, it was as a result of the Espita Consent Decree in '69, and of course, the UFT opposed it. A lot of politicians opposed it. And at the time, we had one of what was considered a liberal mayor, who also was very much against bilingual education, and the battles that were fought at what is now the Albizu Campos School, PS 161 on Amsterdam and 135th. What was it like in Chicago when bilingual education was implemented in its early years?
I really don't study bilingual education, so I can't tell you as much about that. And the earlier migrations, I do know that there was, in most of the newspapers when you start, and it's just the same as Chicago, as New York, I should say, it was always this idea of the drain in terms of the funding for schools and what was going on there. And then I think the other pressure was, trying to desegregate schools, and so that you started to see some conflicts with African American communities because of this way in which saying that you actually needed to separate kids out in order to kind of be able to prepare them, right, for their education. And so what were the ways in which some people felt that you wind up resegregating, but I don't know as much about
Because that's
the
certainly
battles
something
itself.
that Dr. Padilla, with tremendous foresight, looked upon in this book,
Mhm.
again, in '58, and of course in '68, before the Espita Consent Decree.
But in the 1940s in Chicago, they're also contending with a broader Mexican community. And so as the Puerto Rican community starts to come into Chicago, there's a conceptualization of Puerto Ricans as monolingual Spanish speakers, as foreigners. So as they're interacting with, fellow members of the city of Chicago, they're not imagining them as U.S. citizens. They're imagining them as foreigners like their Mexican counterparts. And so in terms of thinking about issues that had to do with bilingual education, that was probably the furthest thing from their mind. It was more of an assimilationist kind of paradigm if they were to become U.S. citizens. And in fact, they already were. But in the minds of of the folks in the city of Chicago, that was not the case.
And this is one of the things that Felix Padilla actually points to in Latino ethnic consciousness, is that bilingual education became one of the ways in which, or that you started to see Mexicans and Puerto Ricans kind of forming political alliances as
The Brown
Latinos.
Berets in the 60s, right.
Exactly, and so that you started to see how they would connect with one another, where it wasn't about that this is a Puerto Rican issue or a Mexican issue, but they started to kind of see themselves as Latinos fighting for certain kinds of rights. So it was bilingual education. They connected that to housing. They connected that to issues of transportation.
Yes.
Could you speak of Dr. Padilla's class background as a student coming from Puerto Rico to Chicago in relation to the class background of the Puerto Rican migrants in the diaspora?
She was very much middle class. I do talk about something that's really interesting, is that we tend to think of migration to the U.S. as only labor migration, but we don't tend to think about the student migrants that came. And that, especially given what Benitez was doing, his project, you actually had groups of Puerto Ricans coming in as students. They weren't always connecting, though, with the workers. And so that was what was very different and interesting about what happened in Chicago, is that Elena Padilla and Muna Munoz Lee, when they learned about the labor recruitment of the domestic workers, but men were also being recruited to work in the steel mills, and then also there was men to work in the foundries. They went out to kind of figure out what's going on with these workers, and they're the ones that wind up documenting, in terms of the labor wages, how all of these deductions were being made, so people would wind up with a check of $1 after after a week's worth of pay, at the end of the day. And so it was because of them that they actually wind up having to change the recruitment policies to come to the United States, especially when it came to domestic workers. So there was that dividing line, but there was a way in which these women were actually they found common cause in terms of the labor rights of women.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like what you mentioned also, in the sense that I think that they brought along a very Latin American tradition of university as political practice, not like in the U.S. where the university is viewed as completely separate from political participation a lot of times, but rather the fact that they didn't see their work as something that was very ivory tower, even if they were at the University of Chicago. They really felt that their work could transcend, and that intellectually it needed to transcend those walls of the University of Chicago to involve people that they felt belong to their community, broadly defined, differently defined. And I think that that's what made Elena Padilla so different from all the other scholars that also went on to become the leading names in anthropology. Eric Wolf, Sidney Mintz, all of them were part of her cohort later on when she came to Columbia University. And all of them went on to become very traditional, very mainstream, very well-known people in the field of anthropology. But Elena Padilla was kind of sidetracked, largely I think because of that kind of interest in seeing her academic work as part of something bigger than the university.
And she will tell you that she does the work in Chicago. It becomes the master's thesis because she was first interested in the laborers. And so then when she starts to talk to her professors at the University of Chicago, they tell her, this is really interesting, you should study this. So this particular academic project actually came first from her political commitment. And they wrote, where the University of Chicago is located is on the south side of Chicago. They had to ride a bus all the way to the north side when transportation wasn't really great. So they went out of their way to kind of find these workers and get their stories.
And I think there's another issue that I think has yet to be explored in Puerto Rican scholarship that revolves around this cohort that was brought by Benitez. Elena Padilla is the only one, if my memory serves me, of the much broader cohort that went to the University of Michigan, University of Chicago, and Harvard that stayed in the U.S. The rest of those cohorts returned to Puerto Rico and became leading figures in the intelligentsia of Puerto Rico. and leading figures in kind of Munoz Marin's project, and heads of cultural affairs, of human resources, and so forth. And the legacy of their scholarship is much of what we have available to us in the social sciences and sociology and anthropology. And so it would be interesting as a study to think about all of those young scholars who were sent to study the great books, who then returned to the island, and what became of them and their legacy as compared to the legacy of Dr. Padilla, who opted to remain and study the Chicago Ricans and the New York Ricans. I think that's an important study, an important intellectual contribution that we have yet to make.
I was going to ask, I know you work at C. Wright Mills, certainly who became quite noted as a progressive sociologist at the quotes. Does she comment on the final product of that study?
She's not one, she doesn't write about it. I'm sure she has a lot of comments about it. Although she's got, in the edited volume, I actually found, she wrote a book review of La Vida. And it's a scathing book review of La Vida, and I had never seen it before, and so she does have very strong opinions about what happened, but she was not the one who was going to write about it, I think, in terms of her own publications at the time.
In fact, I think she's the only one that wrote, to me it's an objective but a clear vision in terms of what La Vida was about. And she has very definite ideas in terms of where the principal author, where Lewis was coming from.
And it's interesting because she the one compliment she gives the book is that she says that the translation was so faithful, that it was actually somewhat exhibitionist or something like that. The person who was actually doing the translations was Muna Munoz Lee. So she was actually giving, I'm reading it as she's giving Muna Munoz, yes, her that credit. And the only reason you'll know this is, and I did a lot of work trying to kind of make the connections to Padilla, and so I would go and I would look at acknowledgments from books, or I would look at book reviews. And that's where I found where, Muna Munoz Lee was the one doing the translations for Oscar Lewis. It's in the acknowledgments of the C. Wright Mills book that you start to see that Elena Padilla was one of his researchers. And so he kind of comments a little bit about the fact that he's thanking her for the work that she did. We don't really know what influence that had on the final product itself. So it would be something interesting to ask her.
And I think to follow up on your question, Anthony, I always kind of think about the politics of the time as to what it must have been like to have been a young Puerto Rican scholar working with C. Wright Mills. She was also working with Sol Tax, who was considered to be a leading figure at the University of Chicago in the field of anthropology. She subsequently worked with Julian Stewart, who's considered also one of the fathers of anthropology. And then her cohort were Eric Wolf, were Sidney Mintz, okay? Bear in mind, she's the only woman.
Louis Worth was also, she also worked with Louis Worth.
Right. She had in a sense, they took her under their wing, so to speak. And she was doing research in Native American communities in the Southwest. She was doing work in Native American communities up in the Wisconsin area, if I remember correctly. So she was in a sense getting entree as an anthropologist and as a woman of color at that time that was unheard of in the discipline of anthropology. And she was having access to not only those kind of more traditional community studies, but then these urban spaces and these folks who had a lot of power to garner money to do the research in New York and Chicago and elsewhere. And she had to navigate those spaces. And you see in some of her private letters and correspondence, the tensions over what got funded and what didn't, and where she was ambiguously positioned in relationship to that. That I think is a whole nother set of studies, but whether or not she will talk about those things is she's a product of her time and a product of the discipline, of those disciplines at that time. But there are moments when she says things that are quite revealing. In an interview that Merida and I did with her, I'm gonna say maybe 10 or 12 years ago, we were in a coffee shop with her and I asked her about the Julian Stewart People of Puerto Rico project. And what she said to me was that she always remembered that when she walked down the corridor at Columbia University, people used to say, there goes Stewart's boys. And so she left it at that. She didn't say anything more, but the silence spoke volumes to me, thinking about what must have gone through her mind every time she walked down, the corridor at Columbia University and she was referred to as one of his boys. And considering she was a senior researcher with a PhD already at that time, the other members of the group were still graduate students, and that she was the only senior Puerto Rican scholar among that group, and certainly not being given the respect that she deserved as a woman and as a scholar. And she said it by just revealing that one sentence to us.
Well, that's not surprising.
Well, of course, it wasn't surprising.
We still don't get it till today, so,
Right.
I mean, I don't mean it from that point of, I don't mean it from it not surprising at that time. What I mean is that even right now, you don't get that same respect and acknowledgement. Not truthfully.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, within that vein, let me build a little bit on the People of Puerto Rico project. How many of you are familiar with the Julian Stewart volume, edited volume? Just to kind of get a sense. Okay, so the edited volume was a project of the anthropologist Julian Stewart, who in a sense was trying to understand culture change. And he was trying to challenge, for those of you who have think about your courses way back in sociology, the work of Robert Redfield and his understanding about little communities and culture change. And what Stewart was trying to explore was to what extent in different kinds of environments did culture change take place. And so he was given funding by various organizations, including the University of Puerto Rico, to go to Puerto Rico to engage in this study in the 1940s. And so he took a host of young scholars with him to engage in that study, including Elena Padilla. And so Eric Wolf went and studied a community where they produced coffee. Sidney Mintz went and studied a community where there were sugar plantations to study sugar. And each was studying, in a sense, a different ecological zone, and as urbanization was taking place in these areas, they wanted to understand how the community was being transformed and what kinds of change was happening. But in some ways, what he also wanted to do was to link all of those communities to kind of broader issues happening in Puerto Rican society. But remember that this was taking place at the same time that the Muñoz government was being solidified, and it was also happening at a time when they were thinking through Operation Bootstrap. And so that there are an enormous amount of limitations to the study, but they're all separate kind of community studies. And Elena Padilla was asked to participate and to conduct one of those community studies, but her perspective was of an insider-outsider relative to the rest of the participants in the study, who it was the first time that they were going to Puerto Rico and were coming as outsiders to try and get their doctoral degree as a result of the studies that they were engaged in. So there was an enormous amount of tension because Elena, being from the middle class, having a relationship with with Munoz's family, had an insider's perspective and understood something about the cultural specificity about what you could ask and what you couldn't and how you could go about doing research. That created tension. But you know, in the social science mode, you know, Mintz and Wolf were correcting her work. And I found some of this in the archives at the University of Illinois. And so she should have been the one correcting their work. But in the context of kind of power politics in North American anthropology, she was, I think she was relegated almost to kind of a secondary position, where I would argue she should have been relegated to that primary position. But therein lies the politics of the discipline, the politics of gender,
Politics of money.
and the politics of money and ethnicity. I mean, for those of you who have studied the People of Puerto Rico manuscript, it was watered down because there were concerns, also kind of during the height of its publication, that it was too much of a leftist kind of argument. And at first they wanted to call it The Eagle and the Lamb, and it was highly opposed. And so they ended up with this nondescript title, The People of Puerto Rico. And if you read it, it really isn't anything about the people of Puerto Rico. It's about these different ecological zones that people lived and worked in. But that nondescript People of Puerto Rico allowed it to be able to be supported by the Puerto Rican government, the U.S. government, and as well as the different agencies that supported the project. So again, think about the kind of scholarly and subject and political position of Elena Padilla having to negotiate her role as a scholar and participant in that project. And I would argue that's a whole other study to be written. Other comments? Okay, I'm a little concerned that she's not here. But let me, while we're waiting for her, just say that there were many who thought that after she engaged in some of these critical projects in the 1940s and the 1950s, that she actually left the academy, and that actually was the furthest thing from the truth. She had been working and making critical interventions and involved in community engagement in New York, in the Bronx, in East Harlem, and elsewhere. She was doing critical work at St. Barnabas Hospital, and she was also working as a professor of health policy and management at the Robert Wagner Graduate School of Public Service at New York University, where she became professor emerita. And so throughout the 70s and well into the 80s and 90s, I don't have as much of the publications of hers in the 70s, but I do have copies of publications of hers well into the 80s and 90s, where she single-authored works dealing with health issues in the Puerto Rican community and the larger Latino community in New York. And then in the 90s, when she was asking some really critical questions as she co-authored works with a number of scholars about health policy in the United States. And I reread some of those publications over the last couple of days, and I actually was astounded to see the extent to which she was perceiving the kinds of changes that were going to occur in the health system of the United States. So she made a critical intervention in her analysis of managed care, in her analysis of the lack of commitment in terms of providing support for the poor and the working poor is access to medical services. And so as I read those publications, I would have to say a real smile came to my face, because I remembered again Up from Puerto Rico. Because Up from Puerto Rico, I think it was a precursor So that work that she'd been engaged in behalf of the Puerto Rican community and health services. She said in one of her publications in the 1990s, and I quote her, "A cleavage persists between health, human service organizations, and poor people of diverse cultural backgrounds. Anthropology can play a major role in the development of healthcare delivery organizations that are transculturally viable." And she ends that essay by saying, "The agenda is still unfinished," end quote. And she wrote that in 1995. And as I reflect on that in 2013, I think our agenda is still very much unfinished. And she understood that then, and I think still understands that. So, do you want to add any more to this? I can talk about her for days, but I hope she will arrive so you can hear it from her.
I think one of the things, for the group of us that decided to work on the edited volume, something that was really important for us was the fact that she is still alive. And that we wanted her to be a full participant in this particular project. So she actually, the most she would do was she was gonna write the preface, because one of the things that she told me was the stuff that happened in the 40s happened so long ago and my memory's really bad, so I don't wanna kind of go into that. So you all can do that work. I've already written my piece, which was the thesis. But then she did this kind of piece, just very briefly, revisiting these things. And one of the things that I think I'm most proud of is the fact that it's not just a work that reclaims her, but that gives her a say in how she's being reclaimed. And she disagrees with us in some respects. And I think it's really important that she disagrees with us sometimes, as she's also fully supporting, I think, this new generation of scholars. And for me, I think that that's what's been really interesting and probably most critical in terms of the kind of work that she's done. Because again, if we're gonna go back to what Arlene is pointing to, right, she still feels that this agenda is unfinished in many ways. And for her, it's also the project of the Academy and Puerto Rican Studies, right, in the Academy.
Yeah, I had a question about that. Academically or intellectually, she was within the anthropological world. So once the burgeoning, I guess, Black, African American, Latino, or Puerto Rican studies, where does she position herself? Does she teach Puerto Rican studies, or she not think that that should have been created? I don't know, I'm just trying to...
She's actually never taught in an anthropology department either. So even though she has her degrees in and from the top, programs in anthropology, Chicago, Columbia, right, and she's worked with all the major people. She is someone who she very much believes in the project of Puerto Rican studies, and so that, but I don't think she's ever taught Puerto Rican studies anymore.
Not that I can remember, but one thing that, and I know that she's so discreet in what she says, because I'm sure that if she decided to talk,